Welcome to This Polymath Life. I'm your host, Margaret McNellis. On this podcast, we talk all things creativity, curiosity, and cosmos. Let's get started. In this episode of This Polymath Life, I want to talk with you about the difference between predictions and patterning. This is something that comes up a lot for me because I use astrology, I use tarot, but I don't use them in a way that is necessarily predictive. I'm very much a proponent of the idea that we have complete free will. That free will is one of the greatest gifts of humanity. It can also be one of the most dangerous gifts of humanity. But I don't like to do anything that impinges on that or creates some sort of self-fulfilling prophecy by relying too heavily on predictions. Now, prediction work when it comes to tarot and astrology can be a lot of fun. I engage with it for entertainment purposes. But for me, it's always coming through the point of view of whoever is offering the prediction. In other words, it may not necessarily be the thing I need to hear in that moment. Instead, I would rather focus on patterns and what energies those patterns represent. When I do this, it allows me to meet the moment in a way that retains my free will and allows me to make choices that suit my core, my purpose, my ethics. When I do this, it allows me to live my life instead of waiting for my life to be lived just by happenstance, by things outside of my control. Now, the fine line here is that there are always things outside of our control because other people are doing things all the time. I can't control the housing crisis in my area. I don't have that sort of power. I can vote. I can speak out about it. I can do all of these things. I can show empathy to those who are struggling in this area. But I myself can't personally change that for other people, no matter how much I might wish to. That's not my skill set. Okay? But for me, I can control how I view my housing situation. I can control choices I make in my space where it comes to creating an energy that feels generative and creative to me, as opposed to something that perhaps would diminish my creativity. I'll tell you right now, my space is not huge. I live in a multi-generational home, which I absolutely love. And I have, obviously I use the whole house, but for the most part, all of my belongings live in one room. I have one corner where my desk is, and I usually do some art there, or sometimes I'll do it out in other places in the house. I have an easel that lives in my closet that I'll sometimes bring out if I want to work on a larger piece. My dresser and bed are in that room, so items of necessity. I've got a small bookshelf where some of my books, yes, are double shelved. I've got a lovely reading chair, which I got for free. I was so lucky to get this chair. It's so comfortable, and I'm sitting in it right now, and I just love to hang out in this spot. I read here, I do puzzles here, I podcast here, I write here, I sketch here, I sometimes watch a show here, I sometimes take a nap here, or I'll pet my dog. All of those things. I've got an art cabinet, I've got some plants, I've got my art and other art hanging on the walls, I've got a collage of about 100 photos from the roughly 1,000 I took on my last trip abroad, which was to England. So I have all these things set up for comfort and creativity in my space, and that's what I have control over. So if I were I'm going to use this as an example. If I were going to pull cards for my living situation, I might maybe I pull the Four of Wands, for example, and the 10 of Pentacles. So to me, that is comfort and home with multiple generations. Obviously, this is me picking cards off the top of my head that suit what I was just telling you. But if I were looking at that, I wouldn't necessarily see that and say like, oh, my job is to provide a home for multiple families and generations in the area. That's not my skill set. If I knew how, I would do it, but it's not what I've been trained to do. And I'm not going back to school right now. So, I would instead take it and look at it and say like, how can I take action in my own life to make my home for its multiple generations more comfortable, more loving, more of a foundation to then go out into this crazy wild world we live in, right? So I'm going to look at it and say, okay, these are the energies of these two cards. You see how you could take multiple meanings from that. And I think for some people, this can be frustrating. They come often, and I've done this too before. They come to the cards or to their birth chart or transits in astrology, and they're looking for an answer. The fact is, I find that when they give answers, they deprive us of our free will, and then we end up resenting them at some point. Or if they give us answers, those answers end up being wrong. And then we question our faith in these systems and our ability to understand, when what our brains are wired for is patterning. Humans are really good at looking at something abstract and turning it into a pattern. I mean, if they weren't, we wouldn't have had all those like images in the 1990s on post. I forget what they were called. I should have looked this up beforehand, but I didn't know I was going to talk about them. Where you would like look at it and unfocus your eyes and like another image comes out of the pattern, right? Human brains are really, really good at patterns. We need to be. It's for our survival. We understand patterns, say, in seasonal changes so that we can plant food so we don't starve to death. So we're really good at patterns. We're not good at prediction. Think about how many people have predicted the end of the world. And while it sometimes may feel like maybe they were right, because the world is so cuckoo bananas, as my nephew would say right now, we're still here. We're still going. And this is over centuries. People have predicted that the world was going to end. And we're still here. Humans are not great at prediction. All right, there's too many factors. It may be possible to say like, yeah, it's likely you'll experience this type of thing. But when we're doing that, we're pulling from our own bias, our own experiences. And maybe we've been through something similar and we're thinking, well, this is how I felt. Now, with patterning, I already talked about it with the cards, but like say I'm looking at my birth chart, right? And I want to think about my home. I'm going to look at the 4th house. I'm going to look at the 6th house for my day-to-day. I'm going to look at the 3rd house for my communications, and maybe even the 2nd house, my material possessions. And think about what sort of story energetically or mythologically or archetypally what's going on in those houses of my chart is offering. Now, I could look at that in my natal chart and kind of figure out where my core is, okay? I mean, I could tell you I'm a Taurus rising. I like to be cozy. I like to be home. I like to take my time with stuff. And I like to create. All of these things are very Taurus rising. And that doesn't mean that that's the only sign that can be creative though, right? Like every sign can be creative. It's a different mode of creativity that brings. But we're so much more than any one sign or placement in our birth chart. We are the holistic thing, all of it together. And so if we try to predict, what ends up happening is this kind of guesswork from keywords, right? And this is where you find things like your horoscope, right? Again, it can be lots of fun. I'm not downplaying it. And horoscopes can be a really good way to learn about astrology. But I don't use them for prediction any more than that. Because I have found in my life and in my practice, no matter who's doing the predicting, me or anyone else, it tends to either become a self-fulfilling prophecy where I steer my decisions and actions toward that because I read it in the morning. Or if I look at it later in the day, I find, well, that's not actually what happened or how it felt. What I find to be much more successful in astrology is to look at the energy sequences that are at play. All right. And think about the different ways in my life I might experience those energies, whether they're opportunities or challenges. And in this way, and I'm not the only astrologer who believes this by any means, but in this way, astrology is not about magic. It is not about spirituality, though it can complement it. And we were just talking about this at this local astrology circle I go to last night, which is run by a really delightful person who's a friend of mine. And she says this, I've heard her say it more than once, and I really 100% agree with her. Astrology is not about that. It's about, she would say it's about data. I would say it's about patterns, because I like to speak in patterns, and think about things from a storytelling perspective, which is not at all surprising given that I've spent most of my adult life as a storyteller. But for me, the astrology really becomes meaningful when we think of it not as some divine force happening to us, but as our brains trying to better understand what we're experiencing. We're patterning. We're trying to look at this current situation and use the data, use the information about the cosmos that we know and have come to understand over thousands of years of study, to try and figure out, when else did we feel this way? What did we do then? Did it make it better? Did it make it worse? Right? So then we can look at our astrology and say, okay, here's this pattern. Here's this sequence I'm seeing again. If I act the same way as I did before, if it made it worse, it's likely to make it worse again. If it made it better, it's likely to make it better again. Again, there's no guarantee that would be a prediction. But a pattern gives us perspective. Okay. So I would say that my approach to tarot and astrology is very much patterning and perspective, not prediction. And again, there's nothing wrong with prediction for fun. Then it's fortune telling. It's not what I do. And that's not what we're going to do here in this polymath life. That said, if you are someone who works in predictions and you want to come on the podcast and talk about it, I'm sure we could have a very lively discussion, and I'm happy to chat about that with you. But I wanted to use this first episode to kind of lay that groundwork so that we all understand going in that when I talk about tarot, if I pull cards on this podcast, or when I talk about astrology, if I'm talking about current transits or something from my own birth chart, or from a natal chart of an event or a person I find interesting or relevant to a discussion, that what I'm looking at is patterns and perception, not prediction. All right. Looking at patterns and perception, not prediction. Now, you can take charts of people who have lived and impacted the history books, and you can look at what they did, and you can usually find supporting evidence in their charts for why they made those decisions, why they behave that way. So I'm not saying that predictions are always off. What I'm saying is that that's not what I like to rely on, because they're often either off or they become a self-fulfilling prophecy and risk stripping us of our free will. There's something about a prediction that gives us permission to act in the way the prediction prophesies. And I find that really not like a great way to spend every day of my life. And maybe you feel differently, and that's totally fine. You can, but it's not my stance. And I think it's important for you to know my stance before we continue this project, which I'm so excited about. I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad you're listening. I'm going to share a link to my friend's astrology website, because I mentioned her philosophy, and while I agree with her, it was her discussing it that made me decide I wanted to talk about it today in this first episode. And, I want to make sure to give credit where it's due. And yeah, I think she's awesome. If I get readings from her, if you ever want to, I give readings too, and I'll include a link for that, but she's awesome too. And you should always go with the person who matches your vibe. She matches my vibe, and sometimes it's really healthy for astrologers to get readings from other astrologers. You learn new things, you get new insight, you see things the way other people see them. Hearing them explain something is often very fruitful, not in the sense that I would necessarily copy their explanation, but it helps to continue to shape our own, again, patterns and perceptions. So with that, welcome to this Polymath Life. I hope you enjoyed this first episode. I don't know what I'm going to talk about next time, because the way that I podcast, it's very unscripted. It's very unplanned. It's largely unedited. You might hear dogs barking at some points. You may hear deliveries arrive or whatever. And if there's something really grotesque, I will try to edit it out. Like if I have a coughing fit, I won't make you listen to that. But I keep it light and breezy and kind of whatever I want to talk about. So on Wednesdays and Fridays, I really hope that you'll join me for whatever it is I'm talking about. And if you want to join me actually on the podcast, I will share a link for how to do that as well in the show notes. So thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you next time. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of This Polymath Life with your host, Margaret McNellis. I'm delighted to have had you here with me. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, follow, share, and review. Please feel free to leave comments. I can't wait to hear from you so that we can continue to make this a discussion you can't wait to be a part of.